everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Today we're going to be discussing terrain. I'm going to show you a number of different ways where you can have hills and valleys, plateau areas, and add in spot points to your model so you can show the terrain as well. Following the webcast, I'm going to open up the chat panel so you can type in any questions that you might have about terrain, and we'll be able to answer those live. So if you do have any questions, make sure during the presentation you post those questions and I'll get to them to the very end. So let's get started. So on my screen, you can see I started up a simple model and we see nice flat green terrain going all the way through. What we're going to do is use the tools to show different terrain options so that we can match a site. So to do that, I'm going to put it down into 2D. And when I work on terrain, I always recommend putting it down into 2D. You can look like you're putting in, a berm or a trench in 3D, but you want to be as accurate as possible. So putting it down in 2D allows you to pick exactly where it's going to be situated. With that being said, I also turn on the grid. I like to use the grid as a visual cue. So when I'm putting in different points, I can use that grid. If you want to alter the size of the grid, that's found under settings and program settings. You can go under there and alter the height and the width of the grid itself. So now that I have that all set, I'm going to go to the Terrain tab. And underneath the Terrain tab, there's a number of different tools that will help you change the topography of the site. I'm going to start with the very simplistic tools that we have on the left, the first one being hill or valley. With this particular tool, you can type in a height. If it's a positive height, it's going to be a hill, and if it's a negative value in the height, it's going to be a valley. With either a hill or a valley, it's a one-point click. So as soon as I click OK here, I pick one point on my screen, and it puts that hill or valley on that particular point, and it's going to radius out from that point to create the terrain that comes down to the zero level. That's the current flat terrain on my screen. So when it puts in that one point and it starts to radius out that terrain height, it wants to know, is it a gentle slope, so I'd pull the zenith all the way to the right, or is it a very steep slope, so I'd pull the zenith all the way to the left. So depending on the slope itself, you can change it to be a gentle or a very steep slope. And then all you have to do is click OK, and where I'm pointing my cursor right now, it's going to create a 5-foot hill, radiusing out from that point. If I was to look at that in a 3D view, perhaps I'll do that in an elevation view from the right, and I'm just going to put it into a rendered outline type of view. So there you can see the terrain coming up, swooping up with that 5-foot hill, and then coming right back down to our zero. So you can see that in that type of view. If I put it into a 3D view, you can see it right there on the edge of my terrain. I'm going to put that back into a 2D view. When you're working on your terrain, you're altering the green bounding box that you see around the screen. So I'm just going to highlight that for us. So if you can't see it very well because of my grid, I'll just highlight that green line that's going around. That's my terrain. That's the extent of the terrain out on my 3D view. So when I'm putting in any kind of different topography for the site, it's going to start and end at that green bounding box as well. I'm going to now use the next tool, and this one's called berms and trenches. And along the same type of process as putting in our hill and valley, we have a positive height for a berm and a negative height for a trench that you would put in. And same with the zenith, if we want it to be very steep or very shallow, and then you would change the zenith left or right. When we're altering this information for a berm, it's going to be a little bit different than when we put in the hill. So when we're putting in a berm, when I click OK, I'm going to be picking 2 points. And between those 2 points, it's going to create that berm, that 5-foot little hill stretched along that entire length of the berm that I put in. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to bring my cursor down to the edge of my terrain, that green line here at the end. Left click to point where I want it to start. Move my cursor up and again, left click where I want it to stop at the other edge of my terrain. From there, you can see we've got the terrain lines coming in here to show the different height of the terrain. And again, if I put that into a 3D view, we can see here on the left-hand side that berm all the way from one extent to the other. So we have hills or valleys that are just a one-point click and a radius out from that one point, or we have berms and trenches that again change the height of the terrain, positive for the berm, negative for the trench, but you pick 2 points and it's going to change all along that point. I'll put this back into 2D and carry on with the various tools. The next tool that I have is called the plateau tool. With the plateau tool, I'm going to sketch out an area where I wanted to change the height of the terrain within that space. So I'm going to create a rectangular area, and it's going to drop the terrain in that area -8 feet. And I can put any height here that I want to. And after that rectangular area drops -8 feet, the terrain itself will reach back up to that 0 flat terrain that we had originally on our site, either very gently in the slope, or again, if I move the zenith to the left, very steeply in the slope. So I'm going to move mine again all the way to the right, so it's a gentle slope to get from 0 to 8. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to move my cursor to the back of the house here. And I'm going to left click at one corner of the house. Left click, move my cursor back. And as I'm moving my cursor back, you'll also notice that it's changing a distance as I move my cursor. And down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see distance and direction. So as I'm pulling my cursor back there, I can tell it that I want to change and create this plateau going back a specific distance. So I'm going to type in 10 feet. I want it to reach back 10 feet. And I hit enter to pick that next point. Then I move my cursor all the way to the left here, and I want to be in line. I'm going to turn my snap tracking on with this corner of the house. So snap tracking allows me to find that corner, move my cursor up so I know that I'm in line, left click there, and then move my cursor back down to the house, the 10 feet, and left click. I've picked 4 points. I could pick many more. Don't pick your original start point. It's creating a polygon shape as I'm going around, and it automatically returns that last point to your start point. So you just have to pick those 4 corners, or as many corners as you have, knowing you don't have to and shouldn't go back to the original start point. So then I just right click and tell it that I'm finished. And then from there, now you can see that the contour lines are moving away from that -8 foot plateau that I put in and gently sloping back up to that 0. So if we took a look again in a 3D view to see what that did, we can see that at the back of the house now, the terrain gently slopes down to reach that -8 feet at the back, all the way across the back face of the house for those 2 points that I picked, and coming out 10 feet, where it's going to start to roll back up the hill. I'm just going to put this into a rendered outline view so we can see those points maybe a little bit more crisp. So there you can see all of the points going in to create that plateau using the plateau tool. Okay, I'm going to put that back into a 2D view. And the last tool here with our more simple terrain tools is our slope tool. With our slope tool, when I pick on it, again, the same type of process as the other ones. A dialog pops up. You tell it either the height or the angle of the slope that you want to put in. So I'm going to tell it that we want to slope up -4 feet. When you pick your first point, that's at the top of your slope. And then when I pick my next one, it's going to go down to that -4 feet. So I want it to slope down, so I'm choosing a -4 foot. If I wanted to slope up from my first point, I would have a positive value in there. I've chosen -4 feet, and now I click OK. And I pick my points where that -4 feet slope is going to start. So here, up against the house, is going to be my 0 to be at flat terrain, left click to start it there. But by the time I reach the end of my terrain here, that's where I want it to have -4 feet slope. So I left click there. And then you can see the contour lines shifting again to accommodate that slope. I right click and tell it I'm finished. And we'll again look at that in a 3D view so that you can see the slope. And I might just move this on the side here so that you can see that slope happening along here. We've got that slope gently coming down that -4 feet from the house to the end. And you'll notice that as the terrain has changed, the paths that I put in, this roadway and this sidewalk, both were put in using our paths tool. So just picking points to show the thickness, the width of the path itself, the material, and then showing its start and end point. But when it puts in a path, you can see that when I'm getting down here and I'm going down -4 feet in my terrain, that this roadway is actually meeting that -4 feet as well. It's going down and dropping down that entire height as well. So you can see the thickness going in there as well. I'm just going to erase all those drawings I just put in and go back into a 2D view. So that's a way of putting in the terrain itself using the terrain tools that you can find here. Hills and valleys, berms and trenches, plateau, slope. These tools right here. So if you have our Pro Architect software, that's the tools that you have available. If you have our Building Essentials and Construction Suite software, you'll find that you have 2 additional tools at the end here. The ability to import site data. So if you had information coming off of a field recorder, you can import that data right from the field recorder. So all of the spot points that they're taking right out on site and recording with their instrument can be imported directly into Envisioneer. And we'll take those points and automatically create the hills and valleys and different topography of the site to match that site data from the recorder itself. The other tool that you have available is this spot points tool. And this allows you to go through and individually put down spot points at different points in your model. So I'm just going to take those away and get back my pointing tool. I'm going to save a copy of this model file, save as. I'm just going to put it back up on my desktop here and call it Landscape and Terrain 1. And then I'm going to open up my original landscape and terrain lesson without any of our terrain imported onto it that we use those first tools on, because I want to have an example using the spot points and the other tools to show you. So I'm going to put this back into 2D, zoom out so we can see our entire terrain, and I'm going to pick on this last tool called spot points. When you pick on either importing the site data or the spot points tool, this dialog box that just popped up on my screen is going to appear. It's telling you that it's taking the terrain that you already have on your screen, the flat green grass, and it's going to convert it into a tin mesh. And by converting it into a tin mesh, it'll allow you to put in those individual spot points. But you won't be able to use the slope and hills and valleys tools, those 4 tools that we covered earlier. When we convert it into a tin mesh, it's expecting you only to show the terrain changes by individual spot points. So I'm going to click OK and say, yes, that's exactly what I want. And now my cursor goes into this point kind of a mode. It wants me to point at different points and show it what the terrain level is at that point. If you look at the bottom of my screen, you'll see we have X, Y, and Z. When we're looking at the Z value there, the very last one that says 0 inches, that's the height of our terrain. So right now it's got 0 inches. So I'm going to point at the front of my model here to say I want 0 inches here, 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 and here. I want it to keep and remember that those are zeros. I'm going to put my cursor in that very last option there, the Z value, and now I'm going to change it to -8 feet. To set that, I'm going to hit the Tab key on my keyboard. So now it knows that the next point I pick is going to be -8 feet in the terrain level. So I'm going to pick that back corner again of my house, left click there, and see all the contour lines now coming out. And then I'm going to come back, left click, come over, left click, and down here, left click. So in essence, what I've done is created that plateau that we had before by putting in spot points that say at these particular points, the terrain level is going to be -8 feet. And then I'm going to click on that last option there again where I put the -8 feet. And in that Z value, I'm going to type -4 feet and hit the Tab key on my keyboard. Hitting the Tab key on the keyboard is what sets that value. So now as I move my cursor around, I'm going to tell it at different points along this edge right here that we're going to -4 feet. And in this point here, I'll say -6 feet and hit my Tab key and come back to this point that it's going to be -6. So you can set all of these various values and put points in so that it's going to match the site data that you have. I'm just going to right click and tell it I'm finished with putting in the spot points. And if we take a look at that in a 3D view, we can see the spot points coming down to my -8 feet, going up to my -4 until it reaches 0 here, where I wanted it to be at the front of the house. So for those of you that have information on your site and you have all the spot points and perhaps they're on a printed out paper, you can look at them and transfer that information using the individual spot points. So you can show exactly where each level of terrain is going to be different. If you're lucky enough to get the information from a field recorder, this button here allows you to import that. If you're using, again, our Pro Architect software, you have these tools right here: hills and valleys, berms and trenches, plateau, and slope. And just as I showed you, they're very effective in being able to show that berm along the entire edge, that plateau at the back of the site itself. But they're just showing those points and then showing it as it would gradually go into a zero terrain, because we had that zenith that we were sliding, or if it was very steep. So that was your only way of actually showing the difference in how it's going to achieve the different levels. Whereas if you had the spot points, you can show exactly where the spot differences are. So you'll have different tools available to you depending on the information that you have. So if you only know that, hey, there's a 5-foot slope at the back, I don't know where it starts and stops, you can show it using our slope tool. Or you know that the terrain at the back of your house is going to have that walkout area and you want the terrain to slope back there, use that plateau tool to be able to achieve that. Now, when we're looking at the elements that we can put in, like our path tool and our pad tool, when you're putting in those elements, I'm just going to double click on the sidewalk that I put in. They have an option in there called Hug the Terrain. So if my terrain goes up a berm and down a berm, and it goes, down a slope and back up a slope, the sidewalk is actually going to follow that and go up and down it. So if I switch back to my other model, lesson 1 here, and we look at the sidewalk, you can see that that's what's happening. It's hugging, oops, that's my terrain. It's hugging the terrain. I've checked that off. If that was unchecked, if I unchecked hug the terrain, it's not going to follow up and down any of the contours that you put into the terrain itself. You can see that it's keeping itself level and the terrain goes up and down around it. So depending on how you want those elements to react to the terrain, you can tell them to hug the terrain or not. And then they will either follow it or lay flat and allow the terrain to kind of break around it, if you will. We also have under our terrain tab a retaining wall tool. And with this retaining wall tool, it also helps to change the terrain. So if I put in a retaining wall, it has to be a totally enclosed wall. So I'm going to start it here from this ground floor wall here, bring it back, bring it over, bring it to this wall right here. And that creates this retaining wall. Now, I'm going to select all similar here. And when you're creating these, I'm going to elevate them down -8 feet and click OK. And then change their properties, because they can be any height, just like a normal wall. And I'm going to tell them that they're maybe a 2-foot retaining wall. So we've got this 2-foot retaining wall going around the entire space as well. If I take that retaining wall here and I'm going to say I want to duplicate this one down, you can create different retaining walls in different areas using those as well. So you have retaining walls to use as well. They can be any material that your walls can be, basically using the same tool as your wall tool and allowing you to go in and put in those retaining walls around the space as well. What I'd like to do now, after I do a brief overview of the different tools that we've covered for you, is answer any questions about the tools that I've showed you today. So as I'm recapping and going over those individual tools again, I invite you to go to that GoToMeeting console on the right-hand side of your screen, where you'll see a chat option where you can type in questions that you might have about the information that I've covered. And I'll get to those just as soon as I'm done with my brief synopsis of each of the tools we covered today. So our first tool that we covered today was hills and valleys. And I left-clicked, and I'm just going to turn off the grid so we can see this a little better. I left-clicked over here to put in that hill and valley. I'm just going to double-click on the inserted hill and valley to show our options here, that we put in a 5-foot hill. And we moved the zenith here all the way to the right to indicate a gentle slope. So it's going to take that 5-foot slope at the very top of where I picked and then gently bring it back down to 0, our initial terrain level. If this was a -5 feet, instead of being a hill, we would have, click OK here and look at it in 3D, you can see that it's now a divot there, that we've got a valley created. So positive creates, and I'll just hit edit undo here so you can see that positive creates the hill, negative created the valley. Back in 2D, I'm going to double click on this piece of terrain, and this was our berms and trenches, this very second tool that I'm highlighting around and moving my cursor around. Same thought process of putting in a hill or a valley, same height type of information, zenith information. The difference between putting in a berm and a trench and a hill, the hill was a 1-point click. The berm itself, we picked 2 points, a start of the berm, an end of the berm, and throughout that entire length, it took the terrain, and you can see those contour lines are affected by the entire length, and it created a berm along that entire length of points that I just picked between. I'll hit normal view and hit cancel there. Our next tool was the plateau tool, and I used the plateau tool at the back of our house strategically to show that there is an area out the back of our house that is -8 feet in the terrain level, so I can have a walkout basement. And again, just like the previous 2 tools, there's a zenith factor here. When it goes from -8 feet back up to 0, is that a very steep transition, or is it a more gentle transition between the two? And then just going to space out the contours evenly between so it can gently get itself back up to the 0. And when we did that, it took that -8 along the different points that I picked. So if I pick my pen here, I picked originally -8 feet here, out 10 feet, out 10 feet from here, from this corner here, and it created that area of -8 feet terrain, and then gently sloped it up from there so it went back up to the 0. And that was our plateau tool found right here. After that, back in 2D, we used the slope tool. And the slope tool is what I use at the front of our terrain to show that from my initial first point, which I pick, that's going to be at the current terrain level, so 0 up against my house. And then the next point I pick is going to drop it down or raise it up to the height that I type in here. So I told it to slope down -4 feet. So you can see the arrow, the direction here, is starting at this point, 0, down to this point here, it's sloping down -4 feet. If this was a positive number, it would slope up from that point to the last point 4 feet in that direction. I then went to a copy of that model, and we used the spot points tool. The spot points tool allows you to put in individual spot level points. And wherever I pick on my screen, it's going to give it the Z value here that I type in. So if I typed in that I wanted at one point the terrain to be maybe a +4 feet, hit my tab key to select it, and then picked a point maybe here at the back of my screen and just kept picking 4 feet, it's going to create a level of terrain there. As I'm picking my points, you can see as it moves those contour lines that there's a 4 foot, almost like a berm at the back there now. So if we took a look at that into a 3D view, we can see that happening at the back here. That's going up that 4 feet, and we already had that -8 foot contour at the back. So lots of different tools that you can use strategically to alter the topography of your site so that you can show what your house is going to look like, your building is going to appear like on the actual site where you're going to be putting it, and the terrain topography differences that maybe you're going to make on that site. What I'd like to do now is answer any questions that you might have about the terrain tools and how you can use them on your projects. So I'm just going to go over to the GoToMeeting console on the right of my screen and read out your questions. I'm the only one that can see the questions, so if there's ever a hesitation to ask a question because you don't want anyone else to know your name or see your question, no one else can see it but me. Okay, first question in our GoToMeeting console. Can you use the slope tool and then turn on the spot points to make further adjustments? No. What happens when you use the slope tool, use all of these various tools here, and then when you go to change it to use spot points, and that little dialog box that pops up tells you that it's going to change it to a tin mesh, it wipes away any kind of adjustments that you had made previously and returns it back to a flat terrain. So you can't use them in conjunction with each other. You either use the first 4 tools or you use the spot level point tool, and then you create that slope by the spot points that you put in. Okay, that seems to be our only question so far today. So I'm going to let people formulate their questions. If there isn't going to be any further questions, we will end off the webinar in one minute, so you can get back to your busy work schedules. But right now is your chance to have a question illustrated live during the webcast. So if you do have a question, make sure you take advantage of this opportunity to ask those live questions. It's a great way to learn visually as we go through the different questions. If there aren't any further questions, we'll end off the webinar and I'll email you out a booklet that covers all of the different tools that we went through today during our webinar so that you can read about them as well. I always like to follow it up with written explanations for those of you that learn better by reading and trying it afterwards. We do record each webinar session as well, so that you can watch the session again up on our YouTube channel. Just give us about 24 hours to create the video. You have to export it out of GoToMeeting and then upload it back into YouTube. So it does take some time to convert the videos. So let me go now to our questions just to make sure that was our last question. And it was. So I want to thank everyone for taking their time out of your busy schedules to join me today to learn a little bit about Envisioneer. These Tuesday classes are a great way to learn, and it gives you the opportunity to take a little snippet of information about one particular topic and learn about it. I'll follow up with an email to each one of you with a link to where you can find the past archived videos and also a booklet that you can read about terrain. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.